My name is Kenton Lobe. I teach International Development Studies here at CMU, and I'm pleased to be one of your hosts for this evening. I'll introduce my co-host in just a minute. As a learning community, CMU strives hard to model generous hospitality and radical dialogue, and it's our hope that this evening will be marked by both of those characteristics. Tonight's event is part of a larger series of face-to-face events that we will be holding on this campus to engage the community on issues and subjects that reflect the kinds of learning that take place on this campus. I'd encourage you to check our website, or as you go out, there are some pamphlets that will let you know what's coming up next. I'll let you know just a quick update that Ray Vanderzag, one of our International Development Studies professors, will be looking at the issue of textiles and clothing manufacturing. Think Bangladesh and the strikes that have been going on and how that relates into the work of international development. Tonight's event emerges from a larger series of gatherings called Germinating Conversations. This work is a collaborative project that began in March of 2012 when a number of organizations came together to create space for intentional dialogue between urban and rural folk about food, faith, and land. Allow me briefly to introduce our partners in this work. Arasha Canada is a Christian conservation organization that engages in scientific research, environmental education, and community-based conservation projects in 19 countries around the world. Here in Manitoba, Arasha is working with inner-city families in Winnipeg to grow food on vacant urban lots and find themselves as neighbors to many farmers at their Pembina Valley Research Station in southwest Manitoba. Mennonites have long advocated the importance of breaking bread together, leading the fair trade movement of the 1960s, encouraging people to eat more with less in the 70s, and through organizations like Mennonite Central Committee, supporting smallholder farmers around the world to grow enough food for their families in contexts where physical hunger is a seasonal reality. The participation of Mennonite Central Committee Manitoba here tonight in this work signals that there is work also to be done close to home. Finally, we've been joined in this work by Food Matters Manitoba, a local organization that engages Manitobans in the cultivation of community food skills, providing public education, and building partnerships and networks in the province and beyond. I'd encourage you to take a look at some of their information as you head out this evening. They're all the way down the hall here. So tonight's the fifth event in this series of Germinating Conversations, and we're very pleased to welcome all of you here. It's our intention to create a space in which the table provides the central metaphor for conversation. Something different happens at the table is our assumption here. Some of you have been part of this work from the beginning, and some of you are perhaps joining us for the first time. We began our work in spring 2012 when over 100 people, many of them from the city, gathered in Winkler to hear 5 farmers, small, large, organic, conventional, talk about what is it that urban dwellers need to understand about farming. This listening event was followed up by a similar gathering 1 year later, right here in this space in October. Then 5 eaters gathered, from dumpster divers to working moms, and were invited to share with those gathered, many of them this time farmers and rural folk, what is it that farmers and rural people need to understand about how you eat. These listening events were intentionally set up to allow space for people from diverse backgrounds to hear one another, not to debate, not even to enter into conversation, but simply to listen. The third Germinating Conversation event took place in March of this year at the Arasha Field Station in the Pembina Valley. If you have not been there, I would highly recommend that you go. It is a beautiful setting. We gathered with all of the presenters from the first 2 events, as well as organizers and a number of new listeners, to sit, think about the process that we had been engaged in, to think about next steps, and to eat together. That dialogue generated a number of ideas, ranging from a worship service on a farm, which we did in July of this year in an old house barn in New Berktal, to face-to-face conversations between eaters and growers. How do we sit together and model this kind of dialogue, this time in front of a group of people? So here we are. Allow me to briefly introduce our invited guests and my co-host at the table here. Those of you at the table, when I introduce you, would you just stand up or give them a wave or signal that this is you somehow? Aaron, I'm starting with you. Born and raised in Winnipeg, Aaron Epp is a storyteller whose writing has appeared in Canadian Mennonite, Christian Week, The Spectator, Tribune, G's, and more. One story he's interested in telling lately is his own. On his blog, Aaron at Large, Aaron writes about the personal work he's done over the past 2 years, which has resulted in him losing more than 100 pounds. This journey has included thinking a lot about the role food plays in his life. While cooking anything more complex than craft dinner once seemed like a pointless chore, Aaron is now proud to say his weekly menu includes a variety of mostly healthy meals. Welcome here, Aaron. Matthew Dueck currently resides in Winnipeg but grew up near Kleefeld, Manitoba, and still identifies himself as primarily a rural person. His family has hunted on land near Kleefeld and Oak Lake for 3 generations and are still largely reliant on wild game today. Matt and his partner Cecily spend considerable time gathering other foods such as saskatoons, apples, strawberries, and growing various vegetables in their garden. He's currently involved here on campus in the CMU Farmers Collective, but has also worked briefly on industrial pork and poultry farms, as well as having deep family connections in the honey and dairy industries. Welcome here, Matt. Born and raised a city girl in southern Ontario, Tina Hildebrand developed a deep yearning to live in the country sometime in her mid-20s. Little did she know it would take another 20 years with moves to Thunder Bay and White Rock, BC, before she finally married and settled down on a farm in southern Manitoba. Tina and her husband Dean live, work, eat, play, and rest at Thousand Hills Ranch with about 200 head of cattle, a flock of layers, 10 pigs, 8 cats, a dog, and some foster ducks. All of their efforts hinge on soil rejuvenation, primarily through mob grazing, but also with organic soil amendments and cover cropping. Welcome here, Tina. Terry, did you guys plan to sit in the order that I've been reading you in? That's wonderful.
I just assumed you were reading it in the order that we sat in.
Very good. No. Terry Mierau, along with Monique and their 3 children, live on Cedar Lane Farm in the village of New Burktal in southern Manitoba. There, they care for chickens, pigs, sheep, and cattle, and grow vegetables and small grains. Welcome here, Terry. Ron Krahn and his wife Anita run a 4,600-acre grain farm at Rivers, Manitoba, with his dad and brother and their wives. The farm grows wheat, canola, oats, peas, and sunflowers. The farm, where all 3 families live together, has been in his family for 3 generations, with the 4th generation starting to participate. Ron is passionate about grain farming as a livelihood and has found the Germinating conversations process to be a challenging and faith-stretching experience. Welcome here, Ron. Melanie Unger. She's breaking the mold, good work. Melanie is the spiritual life facilitator at Canadian Mennonite University right here, where she works with chapels, fellowship groups, and other spiritual life programming. She lives in Winnipeg with her husband John and their 2 children, 8 and 10. Melanie is a primary grocery shopper, menu planner, and meal preparer in her home, and is discovering that making wise food choices is a significant expression of Christian discipleship. Finally, Deborah Martin-Koop. Deborah is the program director for Mennonite Central Committee, Manitoba. She and her husband Robert live in Winnipeg and are the parents of 4 adult children. Together they have enjoyed living the country, village, and city life. Growing and serving healthy, tasty, and colorful food has been and continues to be a purposeful and lifelong activity. The dining room table in their various homes has always had a place of honor. Experiencing generous hospitality extended by friends and strangers in a variety of places and cultures confirms their faith in the table. And finally, my co-host, Deanna Zantingh. Deanna is a graduate student in our theology program here at CMU. She works in Indigenous communities from the Philippines to Northern Canada and grew up on a farm where she lives these kinds of conversations out around the table. You are in good hands, friends. Deanna, over to you.
Growing up, whenever our family had guests over for dinner, it was almost certain that in those hurried moments, as my parents ran around the kitchen getting dinner ready, I would be asked one thing. Any guesses? I just heard it. Will you set the table? And so, well, my mom, the gracious host that she is, would probably insist on having the table set before the guests arrive. Tonight, I get to host, and so I may do things a little bit differently. So first, I'd like to give you a glimpse of the menu for the evening, and then I'm going to ask you to set the table with me. So our menu for the evening begins with first course and a second course. That is 2 discussion questions that I hope will provide some food for thought as we gather here around the table. This will be followed by, how decadent, a third course, in which we will ask all of you to join in small groups with your table and think through something that this discussion raises, a question, a thought, so be listening for that as they're dialoguing as well. And so then the last part of the third course is that we will ask the table to engage some of the questions that you bring forth to them. And then of course, how could I forget? We would be delighted to ask you to share in dessert, a pumpkin pie and whipped cream. So, while this lays the brief menu for the evening, I'd like to also highlight that just as a host may know what they're serving for dinner, they rarely know what will actually emerge around the table. And I hope that this evening holds as many surprises. So now, to set the table. If you think about it, when we set a table, what we're really doing is putting out the tools that we'll need to help enjoy a meal. So, I'd similarly like you to think about setting this table to put out some tools that are needed to help us enjoy this discussion. After all, have you ever tried to eat soup without a bowl? Or better yet, with a fork? There's a rich conversation to be had here, but we've got to approach it with the right tools, or I suspect that like trying to eat soup with a fork, the good stuff will slip away from us. And so before I finish laying out the place settings, I would also like to offer you a couple of appetizers. That is, some more food for thought. The first is that we're not going to solve any problems tonight. We're not going to solve problems in our food system, or probably not even our perceived differences of what the problems are in our food system. So take a deep breath. The menu contains no solutions, but it does contain the opportunity to create a space where we can begin to address some of the tensions we feel within our food systems. And more importantly, to address them together, and from a place of authenticity and honesty. The second appetizer that I would like you to think about is that I believe one of the strengths of connecting diverse perspectives together is its ability to generate conflict. I'm pausing here to take in your reactions. Did I really just say it's a strength to generate conflict? Conflict is not a terrible thing. It is rather a chance to embrace our differences, to grow and to change. The thing we need to know about conflict is that it depends on what we do with it. Most people either like to ignore it or turn it into a fight, and these are perhaps not the most constructive things to do with conflict. I would like to suggest, rather, that we see conflict or difference as a gift. Our differences, though they may make us feel uncomfortable, hold within them the ability to make us stronger and better able to see new insights. They are fertile ground for new possibilities, and I believe that this is what this evening is all about. The beautiful thing is that, will conflict emerge? Well, I have no idea. I have no idea what will emerge around the table, and I think it's okay. But I would like to trust that should conflict emerge, that we'll be prepared to receive it as a gift and to treat the gift giver with gratitude. And so, to continue setting the table, a few comments to the table more specifically. Welcome and thank you for being here, for lending your voices and your ears and your insight. I'm excited to join you and to see what may emerge amidst conversation. While I will be fully present at the table, I think we can all agree that no one really likes to go to dinner where the host does all the talking. So hosts rather get the fun jobs of connecting people's unique experiences and perspectives to each other, and I see that as my role tonight. So please do contribute your thinking and your experience. Each of you has a seat at this table, and I hope it's a comfortable one. We collectively need your voice. You are important. That is equally important to all of those seated around you. Please also take the time to listen in order to understand. Grant yourself the privilege of not thinking of what you may need to say next, and instead simply listen. Like the unexpected surprise of a holy space that can be created around a table, do help me to connect ideas and to look for deeper questions. And to the audience more broadly, thank you also for coming. It's our hope that what happens at the table will spark new interests and insights for you as well. In fact, this is what it's all about. Or I suppose we could have just had this conversation in a room and let you guys eat all the pie. And so while we're at the table collaborating and creating, we hope it's also sparking many other points of co-creating with all of you. And while we have a table of eaters, all of you here are eaters as well. And these are issues that affect and involve all of us. So do help us by listening together. Look for connections and ideas, and for where your own insights and questions kick in, and be prepared to contribute these during the third course. And so in a few moments, I would like to invite Jamie to come and lead us in a doxology. But first, I'd simply like to offer a few more thoughts that I like to think of as a grace or a blessing before we head into the dialogue. So may we together create spaces capable of pleasantly surprising us, and together discover a deeper understanding and appreciation for each other and the questions we are asking. May we come to the table excited to engage, quick to lend a listening ear, and full of anticipation for what may unfold. May we speak and let others speak, learn to receive our differences as gifts, and may we wrestle honestly and authentically with the way food choices impact our bodies, our homes, our communities, and our global world. And may we be willing to sit in the openness that it is less about whether the tablecloth is black and white, and more about how big the table is beneath it. Jamie?
Let's stand to sing.
Okay, so I'm going to trust that everyone can hear me. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Seems so weird not to have a mic. So the first question is this. We have just celebrated Thanksgiving, and your voices here have just joined in giving thanks, similarly to the way many people say a prayer or a grace before a meal. All of this points to food as something beyond the way in which we typically think about it. We often think about food as a choice in our consumer economy, and yet I wonder what happens when we think of food first as a gift. Acknowledging that we are all created beings and that we are all eaters who receive the gift of food, we are also all people experiencing significant shifts in how we view food from the time of our own grandparents. Never before have we had so many choices. So what difference does it make to think of food as gift, and how does this inform the principles and decisions we make amidst the choices of what we eat?
No one wants to go first.
I did reflect on a couple scriptures, and 1 Corinthians 3 talks about Paul is.
I'm just going to move your mics a bit closer. Sorry, folks. They're supposed to be boundary mics that pick up conversation easily, but in the back corners it's still a bit quiet. So if you can speak into there.
Lean forward naturally.
Lean forward naturally.
as I was saying, I had reflected on some scriptures, and in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about he plants and Apollos waters, but God gives the increase. And the other was from Genesis, and it talks about God giving seeds, seed-bearing plants, and this is good food for you, Genesis 1:29. So I was thinking about how when we eat, these gifts are from God, and it would be wise for us to honor the Creator by eating His kind of designer food rather than, for example, commercial processed food or something like that, but go right back to the source of what the designer created and attempt to eat that more often than other choices. Does everybody hear that well? No?
Yeah, and I think for me, I was thinking a little bit about exactly what you were saying about this idea of eating more, let's say, natural foods or whole foods, I think hasn't proven to be very healthy for us. And part of what I was also wondering, though, is where has sort of human agency taken over from what God created? Where did, seed selecting the most vigorous varieties become a point of playing God in a natural system? And I don't think I have any answers for that, but something I was reflecting on today a little bit, about maybe some of the ambiguity in that too, of what is natural and what is from the Creator, and what is our role as people and as His creation, especially in something I was particularly thinking of like seed selecting. Even just from open pollinated heirloom varieties, that we do pick what we want, what we desire within those traits. And what is our role then as we do seed selecting as well? Something else that I was thinking of.
It's interesting. Brings to mind that I don't know where I saw it, and I can't even remember when I saw it. It was a documentary, and I remember that the woman she had corn. She was from Mexico, and she had grown this corn, and she was selecting seed for the next year. And so the person who was filming the documentary or whatever was asking her, how do you select seeds? And she says, well, from each of the cob, I take one of the really nice big ones, and then, or from a nice big cob, I'll take some seeds from that, and then from the cobs that didn't do very well, I'll take a few seeds from that, and from the cobs that looked okay, I'll take a few seeds from that. And then the guy said, well, this was a North American who said, really, if you're seed selecting, you should only take the best ones. And she just looked at him and said, took a really weak cob and said, but next year's weather, this might have been a really good one. So just in reflection, just in terms of what you're saying about, at what point are we meddling, right? By only taking the strongest or only taking the best. But is it only the strongest or is it only the best? It was that year. Next year's different. I don't know.
That's good. How do you select your seeds?
Way more randomly than we're probably supposed to, unfortunately. No, we usually have some sort of criteria, but it was years ago that I saw that, and it runs through my mind in seed selection. It runs through my mind, and it probably affects that.
I struggle a little bit with the idea of food as a gift. I recognize that the weather that God gives us and the plants and that we all started with were a gift from God. There's no denying that. But when I think of a gift, to me it always diminishes the value than if it's something that I've worked for or I've put effort into. If someone gives, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but if someone's worked for something I think there's more value in it than if someone has just given it to you, even though you appreciate it. So I struggle with the idea of thinking of food as just something that's given to us, because there's a lot of hard work that goes into producing the food that the eaters eat. You know, there's a bunch of us here that are farmers at the table or have grown up on a farm. We recognize and see how much work has gone into it. And so I think sometimes if you think of that, you know, when you hear of these statistics as how much food has been wasted, if we think of it as a gift, it's easier to discard than if it's something that there's a lot of work into, and it's something that Terry has, you know, grown on his own farm and has put work into. So I wonder whether we devalue the value of food if we think of it as a gift, instead of maybe something like a resource. Maybe isn't quite the right term, but it's something that we've added value to it in whatever way, because we can't all be farmers or can't all be growing our own food. And so that's something that we've been thinking about. We've been tossing this around at the kitchen table at the farm this morning, and you know, that was one of the thoughts that came up, was that do we devalue the value of it by calling it a gift?
If somebody spends a lot of time creating something and then give it away and it's not appreciated, boy, that does hurt, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When you think, and if I think about the amount of effort my husband puts into raising grass-fed beef, and if we just gave it away and people threw it out because they didn't feel like, it's like, oh, that would be devastating. Like, yeah, I see your point.
So it's the idea of adding, because we've worked at it to get it to the point where it is, even though we've taken all those different things that God's given us, we've made it into something, and we've molded it, and you know, whether we've selected or different things. But I don't know, it's something to think. That's something that I've been thinking about, at least.
One of the things that I got thinking about in relation to the question of food as gift is thinking about many of the people that I have interacted with in the past, or even people within my own family, who have struggled to put food on the table, and for whom, when they put out those few dollars to purchase the food, can they even think of it as a gift, because it's taken such hard work to get there, or they have to work really, really hard, not necessarily at producing the food, but they have to work really hard at being able to afford probably not even really good food. And so what's their relationship to food as a gift? And yet, at the same time, I've been so often the recipient of food that's been really hard earned and that's been shared with generosity. And so obviously there is that relationship of gift, but it got me thinking about the imbalance between many of us around access to food.
Not being a farmer or having any real interest in growing my own food, let's be honest. I have to think of food as a gift, because if I don't, and I care about body stewardship, then I will hoard and take more, perhaps, than is rightfully mine to take. If I think of it as a gift, and I think of the global context, then I'm more apt to take what's reasonable, take an amount that's reasonable, and share. So because I'm not part of the growing process, it's a lifeline for me to think of food as gift, because that keeps my choices in check, I guess. So.
Yeah, I'd echo what Melanie said. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it very much as a gift until we got that question a couple days ago, but I think not being a farmer, it does add value to think about it as a gift, because when I think about a gift, you think about something that you want to take care of, you think about something that you appreciate. So thinking about food in that way, being a good steward of this gift that we've been given is helpful for me.
I wonder, getting back to what, coming around and then to what Ron was saying, because my first reaction to that, to the idea of food as gift, because in the question it didn't say as gift from God, it only said as gift. So then, as somebody who raises animals for food and who grows vegetables for food and producing food for livelihood, I get what you're saying. And that was my first, that I really sort of wrestled with that for a little while. It's like, sounds like a great idea if you're not a farmer, right? We'll just grow all this food and just give it away. Aren't we just these happy gift givers, right? But, so obviously on an economic level, it's from our perspective, that's not a possibility. But on the other hand, as I think about it more, for someone to receive a gift, to feel as a consumer, then as an eater, to receive this, whether you paid for it. I mean, okay, let's just admit we all pay. If you're buying food, you're paying for it, right? So if you're not growing it yourself, you have to buy food. So you put that money, but if you still see it as a gift, as opposed to something that you now own because this was my money and now that's my food and I can do whatever I want with it, I think that it would change that attitude of waste, for sure, of buying too much, for sure. But back on the producing side of food, I think that for me, the most important thing about accepting food as a gift has a number of corollaries that go with it. And one of them is, if food is a gift, then so is the soil that it grew in. And if the soil is a gift, so is the sunshine that comes for the plant, and so is the rain, and so is the seed. Because the seed is really it's this tiny little miracle. And if that's not the true gift that makes food the gift, then I'm not sure that I understand what is. And I think that it's at our only at our very severe peril that we try to mess around too much with that seed, with that miracle, with that.
Yeah, Terry, I really appreciate that. That's part of where some of my thoughts on this paper I have in front of me had gone to. And I'd also written down that I think the work and the labor and the passion of a farmer is a gift as well. A gift to the wider community and to the world. And beyond that, the other thing I question, you touched on soil and on sunlight, and the idea that soil is built up, what is it now, an inch or something every 100 years, or some stat like that in a natural system. So maybe the gift is also coming from the past generations who are good stewards of that soil. And maybe if we are not being good stewards of that gift, we are also affecting future generations who could receive gifts from that soil. And so now it becomes a question to us of really deep stewardship that has happened in the past, and stewardship that we must be a part of going into the future as a gift, and maybe in a sense also start thinking of nutrient cycles and giving back to the soil that gave us the gift in the first place. Giving back to replenish that, to give that gift back to future generations and to future species and animals and plants that exist on Earth.
So do we think that in North America, I think the stat is roughly 10% of our disposable income gets used for buying food for our families. It seems a whole lot more than that when I see the bill from Superstore for a family with 3 kids. And if you know that in Europe, I think it's roughly double that, 20 to 30%. Do they value their food more because it cost more of the time they spent working or making a livelihood Do you think that affects how they appreciate their food? Like with the cost of the food, does that affect an eater as to how they value it?
Well, there would be people in our community here who would spend way more than 10% of their income on food as well, right? People who are on income assistance or people with large families and one income and so on. So
Right.
I just came from Europe in the last couple of weeks. Is there more appreciation there for food than there is here? I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I'm not sure. I don't know how you answer that question,
Yeah,
really. Because if it's what you're used to, you don't necessarily compare with others, right? It's a good question.
But is the value tied solely to cost then? Because I could flip it on its head too and say that I might value food more and I get a great deal on it. But I'm Dutch, so. So where does the value in our food lie? Is it strictly cost? Is it more than cost? Is it also gift? What else is to it?
I just think back of, if I think of my grandparents, where they spent a lot of their time of their day, or if you look in ancient civilizations and that, they spent a lot of their day just preparing for food or collecting food for the day, for that day. And then the next morning when they woke up, it starts all over again. And we've gotten to the point where we're spending a relatively small percentage of our disposable income for food. And so I wonder whether the relatively cheap cost of food, whether that has diminished how we see the gift, whether we're Dutch or not, or whether we got a good deal or not. It's still that idea of that a lot of our livelihood doesn't involve trying to take care of our needs for food. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to ask.
Well, I think it does diminish it. Like, I never have to think about where I'm going to get my food. And it's always there. I can always go to the cupboard. I can always go to the fridge. So yeah, in that way, I think it does. I don't really have to worry about it. So it does, I guess, diminish the value because it's always there. Mm-hmm. I worked as a produce clerk at a grocery store off and on for 6 years. Even then, I didn't even think about where it came from. It just kind of showed up on the trucks and it was always there.
I guess it'll be more valuable one day if there's a food crisis and the grocery store shelves are empty. Then it will become very valuable.
Like if you think of the riots that we saw in Egypt a couple of years ago, it was 08 or 09 where there was quite a food crisis, and even the last couple of years we've had very high grain prices basically due to a shortage. And all of a sudden now it's at the forefront when there was lots of food, and even though there's still starving people, but relatively there was more food around, or grains around, and so it was lower on the, now you see stories about food in the news, whereas 20 years ago you didn't see that very often unless there was a drought someplace, let's say in Ethiopia or wherever. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right that as the world population keeps growing, and I think the prediction I last heard, listening to Quirks and Corks in the sprayer, was I think around 10 billion or 9.5 billion is where they think that the population will peak at. If we think that we're at around 7 billion people now, that's a lot more mouths to feed. So I think something's going to change, or will have to change to feed that many more people.
It's kind of on to the next question.
I know. They're all tied together, aren't they?
It is tied together. But we've noticed the more food that we buy or produce ourselves that is healthier, more nutrient dense, we don't need to eat as much. So without getting into the next question.
Well, maybe this is a natural segue.
Maybe.
And maybe you'll just move on to the next one.
Yeah.
They've all heard it before, but I'm going to read it for you guys. So a food system could be thought of as a food web, outlining an array of choices and participants around what we eat. Not only is it composed of many food chains that sustain us all the way from the earth to the plate, but also included in the web of the food system is the process of how we get what we eat, and also how these processes affect the greater web and life upon which we are all dependent. At any given moment, I'm sure we could point out a perceived problem or area of unhealthiness in our food system. But instead of focusing on what is unhealthy, I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations. What issues or realities do you think need to be included or taken into account for a healthy food system? So jump in.
Well, we've been focusing our work on soil replenishment, and that's what we've been finding is the healthier the soil, the healthier the food. And like I just mentioned, you don't have to eat as much because your body doesn't need to recover from empty calories or empty nutrients. So that's what we've been finding with just having a garden and working with pastures and using cattle for the mob grazing. Yeah.
I guess if I would see what the biggest issue would be, I would think it is the amount of food that's going to be available. We've gone through a couple of years of bad weather, and many of the, and I'm speaking from a grain producer. I know very little about animals, and I know very little about growing vegetables. So I'm going to speak mostly from a grains perspective. We've gone through a couple of years of poor crops in many different regions at the same time, which has caused quite a spike in grain prices. And so I grow concerned if I think of 10 billion people on this earth, and we're at times having trouble feeding, even with recognizing that there's food waste and that, you know, sometimes it's economic issues or political issues that are keeping food from getting to the people that need it. But if we add another 3 or 4 billion people to the amount of mouths that we're feeding already, I just don't see how we're going to be able to feed that many people without technologies that have, you know, we've seen a lot of increase in yields and different things with some of the different technologies and breeding and GMOs, I'll throw it out there, you know, that we've seen. We've really increased different yields, and so to feed another, you know, 50% or 40%, whatever that number is, that's an issue that I see is happening. And for us, if I think of on the farm, technology has made that possible to grow more food, whether it's, you know, more food per pound of fertilizer that we apply, whether it's coming out of the soil or whether we're applying it, whether it's water use. I read some stats recently that indicated that, you know, we've gone from needing 1.5 pounds of nitrogen to grow a bushel of corn to 1 pound of nitrogen to grow a bushel of corn. To me, that's a tremendous efficiency. And if we think of stewardship, I often see stewardship as an efficiency. How can we make the best use of in whatever that we have, if we're talking about stewardship of our finances or our food. So I don't know, that would be where I would see it. So just amount of food, I think, is going to be a problem.
But what if those increased yields don't have any increased nutrients in them? They're becoming less nutrient dense. Like, then you're just always going to have to be increasing the yields to get a smaller amount of nutrients out of the food.
Do we know that the nutrient values are less?
I'm not a scientist, but I suspect.
I guess I'm not a scientist either, but yeah.
It's my gut reaction. It's my gut feeling that that's happening.
I can't speak for that. So.
It's okay, it's a good thing to look into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also wonder too about where the food is produced. We seem to have a real emphasis on needing to produce the food here. That's something that I think is basically a slogan of seed companies and fertilizer companies, I think in North America in particular.
You mean here for export?
Yeah, like as in we need to produce food here to feed the world.
Right,
It's
yeah.
on, it's kind of really projected, I think, very strongly on North American producers that is the number one goal. How are we going to do that? But I also wonder what we could do to repopulate farmlands in other parts of the world. Not with North Americans who have technology or seeds to go in, but with the local people who are being forced to move off the land because they can't make a living. There's plenty of food that used to be grown in many regions that is no longer grown today. And while there seems to be still enough calories to feed the world, somehow they aren't making it there. And if those are the people that are continue to be undernourished, then maybe it's not a question of how much, but a question of where the food is produced. And if that's something that can be addressed and can be worked towards, perhaps we can work as a global community at a more sustainable food system that doesn't see, shipping through ships or through planes or through trains at the use of fossil fuel, which, I mean, is continually rising in price, which will only make it more impossible to send it to those places. So for me, I think that's the interesting question for me, is what kind of agricultural practices will work to restore the soil that maybe is degraded, and to begin allowing people to produce food profitably at a small scale, which is still the way that I think the majority of the world's food is being produced today, despite what we maybe sometimes otherwise think. But.
If I think of a healthy food system, it takes in, for me, it takes into account so much more than to talk about healthy food, or to talk about, there's community in there, there's all of these things. So the good news is I think I got it all figured out. So here it comes. I think we only need one thing to create a healthy food system, and I think it's relationships. I think where the food system in general, worldwide, where it went unhealthy, was the moment that somebody eating the food didn't know where it came from. Was the moment where there was no trust anymore between the eater and the grower. I think without that relationship, the entire food system becomes problematic.
Because then it's a commodity instead of a food item. It's a totally different system.
Right. I think that the study came out last summer. In Canada, we have 50% post-consumer waste. So somebody goes to the grocery store, spends $100 on however many pounds of food, and that 50% of that gets thrown away. I guarantee that of the people who are getting food from me, I bet that post-consumer waste wouldn't be 10%. And I bet even if something had a little bit of mold on it because it sat in their fridge too long, they would trim it off, because for them to think, I'm going to throw that out, when they would think to throw it out, they would see my face. And they know how much work we put into what we do. Because I make them come out and watch it, or help it.
Oh, Terry, I do have to admit, I can remember one time leaving one of your sausages on a barbecue overnight at the CMU farm, and I apologize for that. Kenton might have.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure somebody came along and scavenged that sausage. But I'm serious about the relationship. As soon as that is lost, and it's not just a food waste issue. And I know that when the last 50 years has seen us get to the point where the farm size is too big for that, and I get that. I get that would be a hard change to imagine or fathom. I do. But I've been thinking a lot about you. Brother, I'm going to talk right to you now. I've been thinking a lot about you since I met you in March. And I think I got the solution for you too.
I'm going to need a human relations person just to talk to all these people that are eating my wheat. So
I think that you should look into getting an oil press, smallest one you can find, and bottle canola oil straight off your farm, even if you make 8 liters of it a year. I mean, I'm not telling you to just do what you're doing with the rest, keep doing it, but make 8 liters of canola oil every year for yourself. Maybe then some neighbors will start wanting to buy canola oil from you. I think it'd be the coolest thing ever.
there's a few guys that are doing that.
I think it's a great idea. Or get together with a couple of the other guys and buy one together, because it's probably going to cost a couple $1,000,
Probably.
and you'd only be using it for like 8 hours a year.
I think you're right, that there is a disconnect, and it probably happened, if I think even in our Mennonite community, back even in the villages in Russia, there was one guy that really liked working with pigs. Well, he probably started to focus more on working with his hogs, and maybe didn't have a dairy cow because he hated cows, or he wasn't good at milking, or whatever. And that kind of specialization happened over hundreds of years till we got to the point where, I have colleagues in my industry that farm 40 and 80 and 100,000 acres of wheat. And I'm not sure if you grow wheat or not, but there's lots of people that don't, or there's people that are growing just, producing honey. Your idea about the locations, I think is there's a lot of merit to that, and I want to think through that. But if I think of a specific example, like a lot of Canadian wheat is sold to Japan, where they just physically can't grow enough wheat for all the Japanese people. They like Canadian wheat, and they obviously make a lot of bread and donuts and whatever else with that. How do we do that practically, where Western Canada is a great place to grow wheat? We're efficient at it, we're good at it, we have good climate for it. Japan doesn't, and they want our wheat. How do we do that? And I understand that, because I feel better buying my beef from my local beef farmer in the area. I know him directly. You're probably right. I'm not sure I'll see Brian's face if I leave a sausage on the barbecue, but it's that
I saw Terry.
I'm not going to see your face. But that idea of we can only. How do we do that practically when there's a lot of crops, just like bananas? We can't grow any bananas in Manitoba. But some of us really, I don't like bananas, but some of us really like bananas. I can't ever know the guy that made my coffee beans or grew my bananas. So I understand the idea of it, and there's some things that we can do that practically. If it's beef or pork, I like buying my Mennonite farmer sausage made in Winkler or Steinbach. Because I feel like I have a relationship. And a lot of, I think, about eating is what makes us feel good, whether it's the taste is good or whether just the pleasure of eating. As someone mentioned in one of the emails about how many of the times when we get together, it focuses around something sugary. Is it your email? Yeah. That made me think too. I've thought, how many times have I had some cans of Coke in the middle, the table when guys have come over to watch football or whatever. So I'm going to serve water now as well. So, but it's that idea of how do we do that practically, knowing that some locations are good at growing some things, and that's the disconnect that I see. That.
I think what you said is we don't have any solutions, but what Terry said is just do 8 liters a year. And once you start, because it's a hard process. It is to change the way you think about food takes a lot of work. So it's not going to be like overnight, I'm changing 5,000 acres or whatever it is that you do, but it does, it just takes one little idea. And then all of a sudden,
I'm not trying to diminish that. thanks for saying that we don't have to have any solutions. I'm much more relaxed now.
One of the things I've been thinking about in terms of changing our relationship or working at changing our relationship with food in an urban setting is if there were more opportunities or more places where we would see food being grown, and there were more opportunities for urban dwellers to engage with food growing, that could also contribute to a healthier system. And I thought of things like we have more and more community gardens, which is amazing. But even in terms of municipal policies being developed around whenever there's an apartment building goes up, there has to be some land allocated for growing food. Whenever there is a park being developed, or maybe even existing parks, there has to be a certain percentage of land that's allocated for growing food. And if our children and all of us start to see tomato plants and whatever growing all over the place, we develop more respect for it. And one of MCC's projects here in the city is Sam's Place, and we had a green team worker this summer who was able to develop this tiny little garden, which was absolutely beautiful. And nothing got picked out of it from the neighborhood kids or whoever. It was tiny, it was on the boulevard, and it was beautiful. And the other thing that I noticed too is that we had these two sort of sad-looking tomato plants on the street. And but I was watching the tomatoes growing in those pots, and they did not get taken away.